But now linking such databases, let's say with your NSDL database, and then doing an income and a wealth comparison, for example. Some of those things are now beginning to get possible. Again, I don't need to pry into, or any analyst doesn't need to pry into the individual's work, but a meta-analysis of saying, okay, as people have built out their lives over multiple years and you have a sense of their tax return, you also have a sense of their asset return. Can you begin to make some sense? Can people begin to do financial planning better? And maybe that links back to the Paisa Vaisa point. Because see, what we don't have here in India is long-term trajectory of how incomes have moved for people. There is a worldview of saying that people get into a job and that job lasts. That is not the new lived reality, right? People change. And so incomes have become somewhat volatile because people change careers, people change jobs, etc., etc. If there is metadata to say, okay, this is how career has progressed for a 25-year-old over the last 20 years, etc. This is interesting information for people to plan.
Folks, welcome to Paisa Vaisa. I'm your host Anupam Gupta, B50 on Twitter. And on today's episode, I think I'm doing something for the very first time, stuff that I haven't done before. I'm talking policy. We are talking about how income tax has changed in India. My guest, author, columnist, policy wonk, Akhilesh Tilotia. We are going to bust some myths on Indians not paying tax. Yeah, a lot of us like to say that. Huh? It sounds so good on a WhatsApp group and anywhere you go, oh, Indians don't pay tax. We're going to bust that. Akhilesh, welcome to Paisa Vaisa. Thank you so much for doing this for our listeners. I'm thrilled to have you here. Yeah.
Thank you, Anupam. We've known each other 15 years and lovely to be on your show.
How about that? Huh? We've known each other for that long. And actually, let's start from there. Tell us something about yourself because you've done a lot of interesting stuff. An author, of course. And I keep saying that you should write another book. I hope you do that. But tell us about yourself.
An MBA. And then came into Bombay, worked with a consulting company here. But largely my life has been within the financial services. And that's where we've met. I used to write what became thematic research. I used to write game changer research at Kotak. A lot of what I used to write became a book, which is the one that you're referring to, The Making of India. Somehow it ended up in government corridors. And I did a 3-year stint with the government of India. I was what in Indian parlance is called an officer on special duty.
OSD. People who know it, they know that's a very, it's a very powerful place, interesting place, and I'm sure you learned a lot.
Which led to the second book, which is called Through the Looking Glass, which is of my experiences of 3 years that I spent in Delhi. But what that gave me is a policy wonk that you call me now, that sort of a lens, which is, while in Mumbai, I used to look at it a lot from investors' perspective, investability perspective, etc. There is a very important perspective of the government. And I think in this construction of Samaj, Sarkar, Bazaar, I think it's useful. सामाजिक तो हम सब हैं ही एंड सरकार और बाजार दोनों का पर्सपेक्टिव इफ यू कैन mesh all these three, I think it's a powerful perspective. So that's where I am in the middle of these three ecosystems.
Just amazing. I just hope that you get on to writing your next book. Please do that.
Sure.
Folks, so Akhilesh's website is atilotia.com. I'll spell that for you. ATILOTIA.com. You please check it out. All his writings and all his columns are there. You write for quite a few publications such as the Financial Express. And you carry your columns there. So 19th April is when Akhilesh wrote this column called India's Fiscal Contract, More Incomes in the Tax Net. And that's what we are going to talk about today. Just let me repeat that for you guys, okay? India's Fiscal Contract, More Incomes in the Tax Net. Now, I don't know about you, but when you're on social media and when you're on WhatsApp, you keep on hearing this myth a lot. Indians don't pay tax. And that kind of always gets to me. It has gotten to me for a long time because people very conveniently forget that there's indirect tax also. But anyway, and almost every Indian, maybe not a baby, I guess, pays indirect tax. GST is there every year. So Indians don't pay tax. Well, hold on to that thought. But first, Akhilesh, what made you write this column, which we are going to discuss about today on the course of this episode?
So I have this habit, and which is what I picked up in my thematic research, which is whenever you chance upon a good data, don't let it go by. Play around with it, see what sort of insights you can get. And so this is a data set which has come by, and it comes out every year, but this is again the 2021 FY data points got released. And so we started playing with some of those data sets. And I think what I like to do is look at the data from a slightly unique and a different lens. And maybe we'll talk about some of the analysis that we did. So it is more to just understand what is happening. And let me also, since you called out the name of the article, India's Fiscal Contract, it's again a link of the 3 points that I was talking about. Who are we as citizens when we pay to the government? What is the contract that we are getting with them, right? And are more of us buying into that contract was the whole point. I was pleasantly surprised with the sort of data that has come through, given that it contradicts the received wisdom in some sense, and we'll talk more about that. But yes.
Yeah, man. Indians don't pay tax. Okay, sorry. I'm going to start on the trends that I discovered while reading your column, and you've got a nice bunch of data with you also. So first, a number of people filing income tax returns has increased. Okay, now this is factual.
Correct.
Now, what are the numbers, and can we understand what's happened and why?
So very simply, and we can get into very specific numbers, but roughly the maths is in about 10 years, FY12 to FY21, so 9 years to be precise, this has gone about 3x. From about 2 odd crores of people filing taxes, this number is about 6.5 crores of people who are now filing taxes. Now, the common question that arises is 6.5 crores in a 150 crore population, suddenly you're looking at a 4% sort of a number, only 4% of Indians pay tax. So I think one of the key points that I want to highlight is that who can pay tax? By definition, it's income tax. So you need to have income. Now, in a large proportion of cases, that income is largely going to be salary. As you know, there are 5 heads of income, but largely salary. And we'll talk about what the heads of incomes get us as taxes. But largely, somebody has to be working to get that. You can, of course, be what in economic parlance is called rentiers, that you have so much of interest income that you can live off it, but that's a very small proportion. Small, yeah. Now, how many people work in this country? And so many other surveys that get done, the PLFS or the CMI surveys, etc., everybody estimates that in FY21, so the current numbers would be slightly different, but in FY21, about 400 million or about 40 crore people were actively working. Now, so आपका base 140 crore nahi hai, 40 crore.
There's your denominator. Very important.
But wait,
yeah, okay.
Agriculture is not put to tax.
Okay, correct.
And half the population works there. So then your denominator is already down to about 20 crores. And again, we can get very specifics about those numbers, but mota, if you think about 6 crore people filing taxes on a base of 20 crore people who would in any ways be eligible to file taxes, you get a sense of saying, okay, about 30% of people are filing taxes. 2 other important points that one should note in this is that one is a large number of these people are also, given the structure of our labor force, either casual laborers or not necessarily on contracts which make them earn enough to be part of the tax bracket in that sense. So you should never expect that of all the people who are working, there will be a 100% number that you will ever reach.
I want to just stop you there. There's a very important distinction here between contract labor and people who have salary slips.
Correct.
Usually, in my opinion, the people who pass opinions are the guys who have salary slips. Talking about people who are... See, contract labor, as you know, is not the best sort of income or the best sort of job to have. Everybody would like to have a recurring income coming in every year with benefits on that. So go on about this point, about contract labor. Let's, bring that out or whatever, flesh it out there.
So the simple point is, and again, if you look at a slightly different database, and again, one of the things that I like to do is to look at these data from different perspectives. So if you look at the PLFS data set, the Periodic Labor Force Survey databases, etc., a typical contract labor person earns about 90,000 rupees or so per year.
Wow.
That is a very small number compared to the 5 lakh that makes you eligible to be part of the tax bracket.
90,000?
Unfortunately, those are the numbers that we are talking about.
8,000 a month? 9,000 a month?
That is the...
Yes. Please go on, sorry.
So, if you look at the structure of regular wage earners, contract laborers, and what is called self-employed, etc., again, there is a small proportion that are regular salaried and wages, and that's a reasonably small proportion, about a third of these. So, in my opinion, again, as I looked at this data, 20 crores, 6 crore file taxes, about 30% of the labor force is largely salaried and regular wage. I get a sense of saying that people who are supposed to pay taxes are increasingly part of that tax net, and which is the second part of my title, that more and more people are now part of the tax net. And the interesting thing in a digital world is once you're part of the tax net, once you have your PAN number, etc. And now remember, 15 crore demat accounts. So 15 crore PANs are already there. Once you're part of that ecosystem which requires you to be digital, it's very difficult to opt out of that digital system. And which is where I talk about where this is coming in. We'll talk more about how much money is coming in from which segments, etc. And there you will see that a lot of that income is now beginning to come into tax.
So now we've got the number there that it's about 6.6 crores on a reasonable base of 20 odd, okay?
Correct.
So now we've come to the number of people filing taxes, and that has gone up 3 times in the last 9 years, okay? Yeah. Let's move to the next thing, which I found again quite interesting, is gross total income, which I'm assuming is you've taken the income tax, the incomes declared divided by the number of people.
So let's actually remain only at the gross total income without dividing it by number of people to start with. If you look at, again, the fun in all of this data analysis is to not just look at one database, but to look at another database also together. So if you take the total of all the incomes that people have declared as their gross total income when we file our taxes, etc. In effect, I look at two large data points. One is the gross total income and what is the tax payable, right? If you look at what it was declared in 2012 and what it was declared in 2021, and forget the absolutes, maybe we'll come back to the absolutes, but you divide it by the GDP of those years.
Nice.
Right?
Okay.
So then you begin to get a sense ki, okay, GDP is the sum total of all the incomes. What proportion of income has come to tax? Our analysis shows that that number has gone from 25% to about 35%.
10 percentage points
of increase that has taken place in the tax to GDP ratio. Which
Amazing,
means that if there was 100 rupee of income, only 25 was coming to tax then. Again, that is not necessarily a sign of under declaration, etc., etc. We'll talk about that. But that proportion has gone from 25 to about 35%. And that is a very positive sign that more incomes are coming to tax. So we can get into the specific numbers, but the proportion is, I think, the more interesting one. And again, this number will almost never reach 100 because there will be a large number of people who will be below income tax ranges. So if you're inching towards the 50% mark, I think you are doing perfectly fine on this count.
In a way, you spoke about tax to GDP. Can we go into these broad, because this is a big number. I mean, a lot of policy people look at this number, and India is apparently lagging. So can we go on this tax to GDP number a little bit deeper?
Let's split that number out. So one is the tax to GDP that is collected by the center across a wide variety of taxes and also by states. What we will focus on, as you said in your introduction, only on the income tax. So and in income tax, largely the two segments of populations which pay out the largest amount of taxes is individuals and corporates. As you know, there are 7 types of persons defined in the Income Tax Act, etc. But a large proportion of income tax that comes into the government comes in from these two heads, individuals as well as businesses. Now, one of the interesting pieces of analysis that we did in our paper was to look at what is the average rate of tax that an individual pays. Now, average is not necessarily your tax rate and my tax rate.
Obviously.
It depends on where we are on the slabs. And again, remember that a large number of people who are filing taxes are just coming into the filing system. So their incomes by definition will be lower. Right? So 2 crore going to 6 crore, not everybody is coming into a high tax bracket. People are beginning to nudge into the lower tax brackets, etc. You'll be surprised. I was actually surprised when I first did these numbers. The average tax rate in India for individuals has hovered in the small range of 10.5 to 11%.
Wow. 10.5 to 11.
Correct.
That's very narrow.
It's a very narrow and a small number. Because again, whenever a tax conversation happens, it happens that the maximum marginal rate is already 43%, etc. Which maybe a few hundred people in this country potentially pay. But if you look at, again, averages, sometimes it's useful to look at averages. The number has not budged in the last 9 years has remained in that small range of 10.5 to 11%. Now, while keeping it in that small range of 10 to 11%, what we have seen is that the income that is collected from such folks, from individuals, has gone up as a percentage of GDP. And that is an interesting point because individuals would contribute about 1.3% of GDP as taxes. So all the big ads that you see of making India by contributing to taxes, etc., as individuals, we would only contribute about 1.3% of that as individuals. That number in 9 years has gone up significantly to 2.1%. And it is a linear rise up.
Correct.
And what this tells you is that if this trend continues of gaining about this 10 basis points every year, you're suddenly looking at the government's tax to GDP ratio from individuals beginning to go up. And again, at low tax rates and as more and more people begin to come in, this just provides the government a much larger tax base. I'll also point to say that the business segment, which I said is the other big segment, has contributed largely in the range of about 2.6% of GDP as taxes over the last 9 years. It's moved around somewhat. And as we see the tax rate that has been cut over the last few years, I expect that the Laffer curve effect will begin to come into place, which is as more and more incomes now begin to get and the profit cycle changes, etc., profitability cycle changes, etc., businesses will start to contribute even more. So both on the individual side as well as on the business side, you should expect to see tax to GDP ratios go up and more of us contributing more to that, which has downstream impacts on what governments can do with that money.
Correct. So if I've got this right, if I were to make a bulge chart for income tax, like you said, the 10 to 11% number which is there, which is what on average, most people pay.
Correct.
Considering that, quite a few of them are coming in, entering in. It's a very interesting number given that, like you said again, the bulk of the discussions happens at 43%. What does the bulge look like if I look at just the rates of tax from, lower to upper? How, because I think what's happening here is that a very large population of people are paying a low rate of tax and then going to the opposite side. What does that look like?
So that's an interesting question. And I think the way to look at it is people who pay below 5 lakhs, people who file income below 5 lakhs or so, that proportion was roughly about 50% of the total would be below 5 lakhs.
Wow.
That proportion has come down to only about a third now.
50% to 33%.
To 33%. So increasingly people are moving also into higher tax, higher income brackets, and hence by definition paying slightly more.
Correct.
There is a small problem that economists would talk about, that these are nominal numbers that you're talking about. So 5 lakh in 2012 is very different from 5 lakh in 2021.
Let's not go into the nominal versus real and that base effect.
But increasingly what you're seeing is that the proportion of incomes that people are getting, and so the bulge is now beginning to move up. And this kind of makes sense. And again, let's reflect back on some of the numbers that we were discussing earlier. We were saying that the per capita income is about 2.5 lakh rupees, right? A typical household is a 4-member household, slightly more than 4-member household, which means a typical household's income is about 10 lakh rupees or so, right? On an average.
Okay.
Now, by definition, that's where the bulk will lie. Because again, typically there is a single member, earning member household, right? So on an average, what you're seeing is people who are filing taxes are broadly moving into the 10 lakh number now.
Sure.
And so that's where the bulk is. Is this beginning to move up? Yes, it's beginning to move up, because what you're seeing is while the number of people in a household is not materially changing now, the incomes per capita are beginning to increase as India's GDP continues to grow.
Okay, heads of income. We said that we'll talk about that. Heads of income.
So again in our chartered accountancy, we read all those 5 taxes of heads of income, etc. And somehow in my mind, I assumed that for all the effort that is put in putting capital gains and income from other sources and whatnot, it would be broadly equally split between the 5 heads of income. Surprisingly, that's not the case.
Okay.
And again, it's important to know some of these things, because then you can prioritize even when you're learning for your chartered accountancy, I guess. Salary incomes as a proportion of all incomes that have been brought to tax have gone up from about 50% to about 55%. And incomes from businesses contribute to about 30% of all incomes. So between these two heads of income is about 85% of incomes. So whether it is your interest income, whether it is your capital gains, etc., that contributes to only about 15% of income. For me, I hadn't seen these numbers earlier. I think that was just revealing in the sense of saying that, okay, this is how, if we are to think about policy, these are the 2 big segments to focus on. And which is where, when we did those maths earlier to say where these 2 segments are contributing and how they're contributing, these are the 2 numbers to largely look at.
Okay, Akhilesh, I want to talk about the average effective tax rates, right? 10 to 11%. Now, there is also the fact that what's our tax-free income right now? 7.5 lakhs.
This analysis is of course dated FY21, for which the data has been out. But now, yes.
So 10 to 11%, how does that look to you? If you compare it to our history of personal income tax and, people using all kinds of mechanisms to escape the tax net. Now, those avenues are becoming lesser. I mean, they're closing out.
Sure.
And going forward, you think that this 10 to 11% will remain the same, will increase, or how will that work? I mean, if you're the finance minister right now, and if this data comes to you, how would you be looking at it?
So I think there are multiple aspects to think about in this. One is when people are coming into tax, and when you have a threshold of tax, which is 7.5 lakhs now, for example, which is multiples of the per capita income, you want to start out with a lower tax rate. You just want to get people into the tax net, because again, what you're trying to do is make them part of the system, not necessarily be extractive. And by definition, a large mass of people, as they begin to get employed and as the demographic dividend literally walks into the workforce and starts to get its first set of incomes, etc., that's where you want to pull them in. So the average number remaining at a 10-11% while having a reasonably high exemption rate is, I think, a reasonable social contract, again, that one should think about. Now, of course, a proportion of large incomes or large taxes will come in from people who earn higher. But on an average, this is the number that I would expect. Okay. Indeed, there will be a large number of people who will effectively not even be paying taxes, but just filing incomes. And that's great, because they are coming into the tax net. Now, just to put this number of 10-11% in context, even after the tax rate cuts that have taken place for businesses, etc., the average rate of tax on businesses is about 24-25%.
Okay.
Right. So to that extent, and businesses typically tend to earn higher, etc. And for individuals just coming into the tax net, I think this is broadly the right number. And that number has still taken you from 1.3 to 2.1% of tax to GDP. And if this trend begins to continue, you will continue to get a larger amount of money coming in. So don't necessarily need to change that.
All of this ties in broadly with other data. There's nothing here right now that seems off to you, right? I mean, all of this is now tying in. The reason why I'm asking this is because, back when you started your career on the sell side, say, whatever, in the early 2000s, this data didn't exist. Or if it did, it was lying somewhere, in some server which was not accessible to the public. And here we are now in the year 2024 looking at 9-year data. 10 years ago, I don't think this was possible. 20 years ago, I don't know. So what I'm asking is that now that you've got fairly high quality data which is accessible to everyone, I'm sure that what you accessed is accessible.
It's on Income Tax India website.
There you go. All of this ties in well, right? I mean, when you look at stuff like maybe employment numbers, employment trends, GDP numbers for that matter, that you've got GDP growing at a certain pace. Is there anything, any observations you made that given the kind of trajectory that this economy has had over the last 10 years, this looks good. I mean, this is a good place to be in, or it's not.
It is a good place to be. And I say that again because 3x of people coming into the tax net in 9 years is in itself a very big number. Going back to the early 2000s, etc., when we started writing on many of these interesting topics that come into India, I think digitization has helped a lot, both in terms of people coming into the tax net, but also dissemination of data. So when a 90-page PDF comes up on the Income Tax of India website, etc., they can also just do all these summations, etc., and cut it in various cuts, etc., and give it back to citizens and analysts to consume. That can again very quickly get digitized, etc., and be computed. And I think what is now beginning to happen is a wealth of this digital data is coming, and there is something to be spoken about the sort of analyses that is possible here. In this specific context, I think the fact that you have 6-7 crore people already part of this ecosystem who now also get literally pre-filled tax returns is an unimaginable thing, right? I remember having moved from Calcutta to Mumbai, and then we had to change our ward and figure out which ward to fill in our paper returns in the initial years, etc. It is a very different world now. So I think things are moving reasonably smoothly now.
Kids today are spoiled ना, मतलब अगर उनको बोलो 20 साल पहले हम जैसा फॉर्म भरते थे टैक्स का, उसमें आदमी बोल दे कि मुझे टैक्स डिक्लेयर ही नहीं करना है, that entire reason to not pay became, I don't know, I mean, the good part about being a salaried employee is that you always have TDS. Okay, so whatever you do, you're going to get captured within the system, right?
And now linkages can be made.
Earlier,
right now. If I had received some income from you and you had declared it as an expense, but I had not declared it an income, it was a far more tedious process to understand. And also this idea of doing a TCS when a large transaction has happened. So between citizens, in some sense, what the state has done is both of us are becoming honest by reporting it back to the state, right? And I think that just has created a wider net of people who are coming in.
Yeah, Form 16s are available now easily enough, and you can file your return within time. I think last year was the first time the government did not increase the date, or rather delay the date of filing returns. I think that was, for quite some time, it used to be a running joke even on social media. कि 31st July का तो extend होगा, August हो गया, September हो गया. But last year, I think the government said no, the 31st July is it. That's it. किया तो किया, नहीं किया तो you're done.
And also pre-filled आ रहे हैं अब तो forms.
Yeah.
So then
the reason to delay.
You are correct, because earlier it would be, okay, I didn't receive this information, I don't know this, I am not equipped. Now with pre-filled forms, all you need to do is basically do a sanity check, and it ties in with your 26 AS, etc. So there are multiple ways in which
I cannot even tell you, वो एक ज़माना होता था when you had to fill up a challan and you had to go to a bank.
280.
You had to go to a bank.
Correct.
Like actually physically get up from your office or from your home, and you have to go to a bank, file it, the bank would have a nice big stamp on the date, and you have to ensure that the date is within the due. Now it's like 24/7. Wherever you are, mobile, laptop, tablet, you can pay your tax and get your challan right there. This is stuff that people take for granted today.
Yeah.
But when I look back upon it, I'm like, wow, yaar. और लाइन लगती थी यार, come on, लाइन लगती थी एक जमाने में. I don't know if you remember.
No, I remember having gone to the Bandra office to fill in, as I said, because that was apparently my ward, and I had to go and fill in some of those taxes there. So yes, we've all lived through that. But I think that's changed. And
And I think this tailwind will continue. I mean, the investments that the government has made at an institutional level within the tax administration, something should be said for that. I mean, that it just made life easier for a fairly large tax-paying base, income tax-paying base. And आप जितना भी क्रिप कर लो, ये अगर नहीं होता ना, believe me, you don't want to go back to what was there 20 years ago.
No, of course. And see, I think this is the whole idea of digitization has made life simple in general, both for the government, which wants to take taxes only to hopefully spend it back on you, and you also want to contribute. So I think the whole process has become smoother and easier, and we are all thankful for it. But I think the other interesting thing is, again, it's not just looking at the databases of one sort of thing. The sort of things that we have done, right? Which is we've just simply looked at GDP and cuts of incomes, etc. But now linking such databases, let's say with your NSDL database, and then doing an income and a wealth comparison, for example. Some of those things are now beginning to get possible. Again, I don't need to pry into, or any analyst doesn't need to pry into the individual's woe, but a meta-analysis of saying, okay, as people have built out their lives over multiple years and you have a sense of their tax returns, you also have a sense of their asset returns. Can you begin to make some sense? Can people begin to do financial planning better? And maybe that links back to the Paisa Vaisa point. Because see, what we don't have here in India is long-term trajectory of how incomes have moved for people. There is a worldview of saying that people get into a job and that job lasts. That is not the new lived reality, right? People change. And so incomes have become somewhat volatile because people change careers, people change jobs, etc., etc. If there is metadata to say, okay, this is how career has progressed for a 25-year-old over the last 20 years, etc. This is interesting information for people to plan. Interestingly, and I think this was for FY13, if I remember right, for some reason the income tax department actually released by category of profession what was the average income.
Did they not repeat that later?
उसके बाद नहीं आया.
अरे ये क्या?
But that was such fascinating information because if I want to become a film director versus a podcaster versus an author, there was at least for once a data set to say...
Where did they get that from? You don't declare your profession on your return, right?
They would have figured it from some place and so that was fascinating data, and I hoped that will continue for a long period of time, and maybe even if now it comes back with some sort of a lag, then as parents, for example, if you're making decisions on where to go, you can at least have a content conversation with your kids. So again, the point about data is not just looking at it in isolation. The number of uses and the number of ways in which people will use it can just be so many.
अगर बोलोगे बच्चों को कि भाई ये हिसाब से अपना करियर ढूंढो जहाँ पैसे बनते हैं जहाँ नहीं बनते हैं.
Not just पैसे बनते हैं. See, what it also does is no, because we are still looking at number rupees, but the number of people in a particular profession, is it increasing? Is it decreasing? That's an interesting trend for people to know.
That could really show you a lot of stuff about how the economy is changing as a whole.
Completely.
Oh boy, folks, sorry, we've kind of gone into a different direction, but it's just that when you get really excited about very high quality data and the inferences that you can have about the economy, that you can move forward from discussions which are just Indians don't pay tax. Okay, there's a lot happening out there. And who knows, if this trajectory continues, we can have even more higher quality data going forward coming in from all this.
So that is correct. And I'm hoping that some of this is also made public far more quickly, in far more accessible manner, etc. And a larger number of people start to analyze it, not just from that one data set, but from a multitude of ways. That I think will also go back in strengthening the system because you can then begin to find out where potentially there are loopholes. What are things that may not be working? What are things that are not tying up? And so that is a big positive. And again, while our conversation has focused a lot only on income tax data, which has been a rich data set that has been available, I think now with digitization pervading through large parts of economy, the type of analyses that are possible are just limited by your imagination.
And I hope it helps the government tweak their income tax provisions and changes over the long term based on fact and data and not social media outrage. Because every time, हर time budget आता है तो long term capital gains tax, ये tax, वो tax. But sometimes I just don't find people saying that, okay, look at the data. Hopefully this will change that. I don't know. Let's see.
It should, hopefully, because what it does is at least grounds it. If there is no data. So, for example, as I said, there were 5 heads of income. For some reason, I assumed it was 20% all through. Because why would you spend so much time and effort to have a tax on a particular head of income if it's earning you, let's say, only 5% of tax?
Correct.
Now, is that a fair question to ask? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Yeah. But at least those questions can get asked.
Yeah. Well, let's hope the government is listening to all this and take some tips on. Akhilesh, you look at a lot of data, and in your career, you've also seen the data change. So we've spoken a lot about income tax side. I've read your columns also about infrastructure, roads. What's happening out there? Any interesting data set that you've seen? Anything that's coming out there?
So that's again a fun, cool analysis that we've been doing now for practically about a year or so. We all pay our tax, our road tolls now using FASTag, right? So over the last 3, 4, 5 years, FASTag has become reasonably pervasive. Now I think industry numbers are 98% of tolls are paid.
You did a big road trip. You like to do road trips.
Every winter.
How is that happening? I mean, so what was your personal experience about FASTag? Because I've had mixed. I don't travel as much as you, admittedly, but I've had kind of mixed, and I'm mostly within Maharashtra. But sorry to be, to taking this direction, taking this conversation somewhere else. But personally, what's been your experience with FASTag?
So maybe, again, being a data analyst, let me throw data at you. I would, on highways, typically drive anywhere between the 60 to 80 speed limits, etc. And so you do about an 80 ka average speed till you go from toll 1 to toll 2. And then you would, and typically tolls in India are about 50 to 70 kilometers apart on highways, roughly, mota. So you go at about 80 ka speed, and then so in about, let's say 40-45 minutes, you have covered that 60 kilometer stretch between two tolls. And then you would spend 10 minutes just waiting in line because you have to pay that toll in a previous area. What that meant is that you have effectively taken an hour to do 60 kilometers.
Correct.
Because
waiting
45 minutes plus 10 minutes. So your average speed was down to 60. Now what happens is when I go on these roads, you continue to drive at 80. Now you can actually do better because some of the highways have become much better. And now many of them are converting into expressways. But because you spend only 1 minute at best at this thing, toll plaza, effectively you're zipping through. So your average speeds have gone up.
Correct.
So in a day, if you were doing, let's say, about 250 kilometers earlier, that would be a 4-5 hour drive with some breaks, etc. Today, doing a 250 kilometer is you have shaved off an hour.
Wow.
So
significant.
So you can cover larger distances, or you can do slightly more leisure activities. So
it reminds me of 20 years ago when the Golden Quadrilateral and the North-South East-West corridor was being made. At that point of time, as an auto analyst, I used to write about how trucks have better turnaround times, etc. Wo time to toll वैसे का वैसा ही था. But imagine that you went from a kacha road to a proper expressway, and that changed a lot 20 years ago. And now this, I'm sure, is changing a lot of things on the ground now also.
And which brings us back to data. So now because we pay all of this digitally, which is also happening quickly as we discussed, if this data were available of how many cars are passing through a toll and different types of cars, right? Because not everybody pays the same type of toll. There are different types of. Thankfully, that data is available. And that data has been available for about the 1,000 toll plazas that exist in this country. And this data is now available for a reasonably long period of time. And so now what you can do are very interesting analysis to say, okay, which are your bigger toll? Kahan pe paisa collect hota hai? How has that toll been behaving? Because now you have a daily incidence of the amount of toll that is being collected there. And then if you look at it, let's say on a monthly basis, and then you see, okay, if this month this is what was collected, how was it either last month or the same month last year? And then if you begin to see some of those patterns, you can actually get a very good sense of the underlying growth of India's economy. So when conversation happens is, are we, let's say, growing at X percentage GDP or not? If you see that the volume movement, number of cars and number of trucks that have moved, how are they moving? If that number is broadly in that 6-7% range, for example, which let's say is the value of real GDP growth, you have a sense that in 1,000 places, this cannot go wrong.
Correct.
Right? Yeah. And what we've also started to do is then cut it by state, because you know which toll is in which state. And then you can begin to see a picture, okay, this state has been growing fast, this state has been growing low. Getting state level data or region level data or just literally that geolocation of that toll data of yahan pe zyada activity ho rahi hai ya kam ho rahi hai is just fantastic for you to get a sense of.
So anything that you've been noticing, anything from these trends, any observations?
So many. One is, especially over the last year or so, it has been a consistent 6 to 9% sort of a volume growth that has taken place across the country level. And this, in some sense, gives you another high frequency and a distributed indicator of saying how growth is happening. Then if you split it state-wise, you can begin to get a sense of what is happening there. So that, I think, gives us good comfort. What we have started using it for also is it can end up becoming some sort of a lead indicator also. In the sense, last June, July, there was a small blip of saying that Indian exports were beginning to come down.
Oh, okay.
You know where you could see it?
Where?
In the roads going between the hinterland of Delhi, the ICDs of Delhi, and the Mundra and JNPT port.
Wow.
The toll that was being collected, obviously, because if you're not exporting and importing as much, obviously the lesser number of vehicles will ply.
Between the two.
Because that is your biggest corridor of taking import and export and taking it back to hinterland. So some of these new interesting pieces of data and analysis that you can bring to table is now beginning to become possible with a lot of digital data being available. So it's not just about income tax. I think if you are willing to experiment with some of this data, there is just fantastic amount of stuff available.
Yeah. So just winding down this episode now, so I'm sure you're part of a lot of WhatsApp groups where you have a lot of people who say Indians don't pay tax. Now, when you read that, what do you think? I mean, do you have a point of view on this? If I were to just ask you on this, I know that 20 years ago, whenever I used to see these presentations, some of them we used to make ourselves. India has low consumption of, just fill in the blank. I mean, just low consumption of cement, toothpaste, metal, bridges, concrete, steel. Ab jo bolo, okay? Because total number of whatever divided by our great denominator will obviously give you a random number. Anyway, that story will never go dry. People like to talk about it even today. But when you hear this thing now that Indians don't pay tax, you have anything, what's your view about that? Given what we've spoken, given so much that you've written.
So again, as we discussed in the conversation, the set of people who are supposed to pay taxes, I think we are now reaching a position where almost anybody and everybody who is required by law to pay taxes is broadly in the tax net. Of course, there will be exceptions, but we are beginning to reach a stage where I don't think we can make a statement to say that someone who was required to pay taxes not paying taxes. Now, as a social construct, do we want everyone to pay taxes? I don't think that is a practical reality in any country, right? Whether it's the young or the very old or people who are not working, etc., they will not be paying taxes. So of the people who should be paying taxes, I think we are now beginning to have a much deeper contract of saying that, yes, we will pay for nation building, and we're beginning to say that that is beginning to come back to us.
Yeah. Folks, please always remember the distinction between direct taxes and indirect taxes. What Akhilesh said was only and only direct taxes. Basically, the point being that when it comes to personal income tax, the base of people who are supposed to pay or can pay income taxes, we are
required by law to pay.
Required by law to pay. Somewhere we are reaching a point where we can say, भाई इनसे जो पे होना था ये कर रहे हैं. अभी इससे आगे जो होगा वो तो अभी पॉलिसी मेकर्स डिसाइड करेंगे. बट आज के तारीख में कोई अगर बोलता है, if anybody says that Indians don't pay tax, that at least to me, I don't know about you, is factually incorrect. I mean, I have a lot of expletives out there, but let me go into that. But let's kind of stop that myth is what I will say. Okay, what lies ahead? Akhilesh, आप क्या कर रहे हो आजकल? मतलब trends to watch out for, or anything else that you have in mind, any other data or anything else that you're doing?
Oh, so I have been exploring a lot of these interesting data sets. So apart from the various other things that I do, as I said, just playing around with data is fascinating. Indeed, one of the things that we are now beginning to put together are brainstorming sessions on saying whatever are interesting data sets, how do we begin to use them, and for what sort of insights that can be drawn from there. Again, it is very difficult for us to know that the type of data that is available, like FASTag data, right? Somewhere in some ecosystem it was being put together, but now for us, we are beginning to use it, let's say from an investment or a tracking of economy perspective that is possible. Is that data now becoming available, for example, let's say in other infrastructure sectors like shipping, like airports, etc.? Yes, that is beginning to happen. On the financial planning side, for example, right? If you look at the wealth of data that NSE puts out in many of its reports, or the NSDL data sets that are now beginning to come out, etc., you can begin to do so many different types of analysis. Again, I would be very fascinated personally to do that income and wealth analysis that we were talking about, because I think from a financial planning perspective, we are very still focused, and I wear a hat of a financial planner from a era long gone by. We still do financial planning from a very individual's perspective. There is very limited that we learn from the mistakes of others in a meta sense. Ki boss, ye dekho, this is how people have thought about it. This is how they've gone about it. That sort of conversation can be brought to table because now we have those digital data sets which can give you that sense. How long have people held on to their mutual funds? What has happened? How long have people held on to policies? Have they made money, not made money? that is such a rich data set from a personal finance perspective that maybe at some point in time I'll get to that.
I don't know what to say to this, man. It's just amazing, right? Because there's right now the topics that you mentioned, the conversations on this just happen in a very random way. They just happen in a very generalized way. They just happen in a way that doesn't seem to be based on any data. Hold mutual funds for the long term. Never buy insurance policies or whatever, those, and they're called toxic and they're called this. I just feel that, some amount of deeper quality of data out here could actually help us make better decisions. For example, the stuff that, the one thing that would definitely interest me is SIPs. Okay. Now, we know that the gross number has been going up.
Correct.
What has the net number been? Okay, that's not come into the public debate. I don't know whether that data is available or not. If it is, then great. Number two would be persistency. Like you said, how long do I hold on to my mutual fund? We all know about the investor gap, which is that the returns that the fund makes at an NAV level for the fund manager versus the return that the unit holders make at that. There's a massive gap out there. You call it whatever. So that is the second one. And I don't know. There's a lot that we can do out here. Hopefully.
You can begin to build archetypes of people. See, as a financial planner, if you are a professional, this is how you should think about a journey, because that's what most professionals have gone through.
Yeah.
If you are a gig worker, for example, or if you're a business person, just having a sense of what your cohort is doing, I think is such a powerful way to think about this that we haven't done. It is all saying that, okay, 100 minus your age is your asset allocation. वो तो समझ गए. But now let's begin to think कि मेरे particular circumstance में how should I think about it? Enough and more to be done on that aspect.
Come back to us after a year. Maybe that, maybe in a year we can have this quality of data coming out and we can have a conversation about that, because I know that is a very powerful conversation to have. Okay. For example, conversations that I keep on having with a lot of people is I want to start an SIP for my maid, driver, domestic help. A noble intention. I love it. Okay. Because you're getting a person into savings. But have you at least seen whether that person has got insurance? And then, the answers start to go vague. Like, I have no idea. Oh, that the person will figure out on their own. I remember that I had a pension tech company startup on my show that does wonderful work in WhatsApp-based messages for insurance for your domestic help. And we know that the government has got life and health.
Correct.
Massive programs out there.
Correct.
That people should at least know of. But sub SIP? SIP, I don't know. What do you...
So it's a very interesting point that you raised, because I think one of the things that at least we try and push is if you can get people enrolled into Ayushman Bharat, that is big enough.
There you go. That's the starting point of everything. Should be that.
The 5 lakh sort of insurance that you're already, it's a huge number, right? So the ability to get people to access what the government is already doing for them, and from all the tax that we have been discussing that is collected, right? There are many interesting schemes that the government has. I think people who know of those schemes can help out.
Their duty to help out.
In some sense, help out. What I've also seen, having worked with a public servant earlier, is that the political class is actually deeply aware of that. And there is a section of the society which actually goes out and actively gets people enrolled for these schemes. There is a segment of society that is also beginning to get disconnected in some sense with government schemes, etc. And I think it is incumbent upon us, and it goes back to that social contract point that I'm saying. We're all part of this society. So in some sense, we have to ensure that we push this point together.
Folks, if you have a maid, driver, domestic help of any sort, please tell them to check out the Ayushman Bharat health scheme. And the life scheme also has a name.
Ayushman Bharat is the health scheme.
And between that, there is health and there is life. It's an easy procedure. You can do it online. I think you'll get a card also that you can start using for both the purposes. And folks, please do that before you think of the SIP. Akhilesh, that's it. We are done. Final standard question to all my guests. What book are you reading? And I know that you're an avid reader of books. What are you reading and any recommendations out there?
So, very interestingly, the three books that I'm reading almost simultaneously, but because they all talk to each other in a sense, is the so-called Ajay Vijay Kitab of In the Service of Republic. Ajay Kelkar.
Oh, of course. Come on.
Ajay Shah and Vijay Kelkar.
People don't know about this book. They should. Well, I've had exactly one guest also saying In Service of the Republic. And then I know anyone who mentions that, I know ki theek hai. It's good. Ajay Vijay. Is that how you refer to Ajay Shah and Vijay Kelkar?
Well, I do. I don't know how.
Probably because you know them, is it? Or not?
No, it's just easier way to remember.
Okay, go on. Sorry,
I do know
interrupted
Ajay
out
Shah,
there.
but it's just an easier way
Vijay
to...
Kelkar is a great person to know. Anyway, go on. Sorry.
The second is a more recent book, Karthik Muralidharan's book, Accelerating India's Development.
Okay.
And the third is Raghuram Rajan and Rohit Lamba's Breaking the Mold. So all three of them talk to this whole idea of how we should think about public policy and governance, etc. As you can imagine, it's in the middle of those three circles that we spoke about. So I just want to understand how people are thinking about it. I have some views on this, and maybe that is the third book that I write.
Please do that. Recap, because there were 3 books. I want to repeat them slowly, carefully. In Service of the Republic, Ajay Shah and Vijay Kelkar. Okay, a classic which should be part of your reading list. Number 2, Karthik
Muralidharan's Accelerating India's Development.
Accelerating India's Development by Karthik Muralidharan. And of course, the third, Raghuram Rajan and Rohit Lamba's book called Breaking
The Mold.
Breaking the Mold. Folks, all 3 books. भाई साहब, आप fiction भी पढ़ते हैं कि नहीं? कि fiction में ज़्यादा आपको interest नहीं है? Maybe some Amish Tripathi out there or anything else, or Lord of the Rings? Any classic?
So yes, Lord of the Rings, etc. Yes, many of the classics. But if you ask me for a recent fiction, I don't think I would have.
Policy यार, कभी-कभार break लिया करो. But folks, that is it. That is a wrap on this episode of Paisa Vaisa. My guest, author, columnist, policy wong, and a person I'm really glad to have as my friend, Akhilesh Tilotia. Akhilesh, thank you so much for doing this for our listeners.
Thank you, Anupam. Thank you for having me.
Come back next time with some data on personal finance, and please write that book.
Thank you.
See you soon.